Colfax threw the file across the table, not at her, just across it, but hard enough that the papers slid off the edge and landed at her feet in a spread of white pages on the concrete floor of the processing bay. He waited. Every other candidate in the room found something to look at that wasn't Winslow. "Pick those up," he said. Sergeant First Class Dara Winslow looked at the papers. Then she looked at Sergeant Major Victor Colfax, who had been running the Joint Advanced Marksmanship instructor course for 11 years, and who was currently looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he is confident he knows how to solve. She did not pick up the papers. "Sergeant," Colfax said, softer now, which was somehow worse than loud. "Sir, I didn't drop them," Winslow said. The silence that followed was the kind that has a temperature. Every candidate felt it. Colfax held the pause long enough to communicate several things at once. That he was not surprised, that he had anticipated exactly this response, and that he had already decided how the rest of her time in his program was going to go. "Get them up," he said, "and stack them neatly on that table, or walk back out the door you came in." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she crouched down and collected every page, slowly, deliberately, and set the stack on the table with a precision that was not compliance, and both of them knew it. That was the first day. She had arrived at Fort Liberty on a gray Monday in February with one duffel bag, a rifle case, and 11 years of service behind her. 31 years old, 5'6". 1,000-yard stare she had earned at 1,000 yards and beyond. Across 3 deployments and 2 combat postings that her personnel file described with the clipped language of official records, and that her body described differently. In the way she carried her left shoulder, slightly lower than her right. In the way she never sat with her back to a door. The Joint Advanced Marksmanship instructor course was not widely advertised. It existed in the overlap between branch Army, Marine Corps, select special operation elements the course didn't name, as the program that produced the instructors who produced the shooters. 42 candidates had been selected from a pool of 300 applications. The completion rate was 38%. 2 of the 42 were women. The other, a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant named Sato, would be gone by the end of week 1, not because she couldn't shoot, but because something in her left knee had been warned about and finally delivered on that warning. That left Winslow. 1 woman, 41 men, and Colfax, who ran the course with the particular authority of a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that being right had stopped being something he questioned. She had come from a different tradition than most of the candidates around her. Her father, Warrant Officer First Class Earl Winslow, retired Army, had done 2 tours in the Mekong Delta before she was born and had moved back to the Tennessee Hill Country afterward to raise goats and daughters and 1 son in that order of difficulty. He had put a rifle in her hands at age 6 and a spotting scope at age 7 and had told her the same thing about both. Most people use tools. A few people understand them. The difference determines everything that comes after. He died 2 years before she came to Fort Liberty of the slow kind of thing that gives you time to say goodbye. If you use the time right, and she had. She had sat with him on the porch of the house in Harlan County for his last autumn and listened to everything he still had to say. She wrote 3 things on an index card in his presence and tucked it into the breast pocket of her blouse and told him she was keeping it there until the work was done. She did not show people the card. She did not explain what was on it, but she knew, the way you know the route home even in the dark. The first week of the course was designed to do one thing, find where each candidate bent. The instructors applied pressure in overlapping intervals, not because a cracked candidate was useless, but because an instructor who didn't know their own fault lines was dangerous to the people they would eventually train. You had to know where you bent before you could teach someone else to stay straight. Winslow bent nowhere that week. She was not invulnerable. No one who had done what she had done could be called that. But she had developed, through a combination of her father's teaching and her own hard experience, the ability to locate her emotional center and stay there regardless of what was happening around it. The instructors called this composure. In 11 years of service, a dozen men had called it something else, something with an edge to it, as if a woman who didn't visibly panic was somehow suspicious. Colfax applied pressure differently than the other instructors. He applied it specifically in the moments when she was performing at her best. When she finished the Cold Bore Confidence course, A full 90 seconds ahead of the next candidate, he called her out in front of the group to describe her process, and when she did, clearly accurately, with the specificity of someone who understood exactly what she had done and why, he nodded and said, "Good, now do it again." Not as encouragement, as a test of whether the explanation had been real or performed. She did it again at the same pace. He wrote something in his log and said nothing further. She stored that observation quietly. She didn't know yet what to do with it, but she filed it away alongside everything else. Her father's lessons, the morning thermal readings, the way Colfax's jaw set at a particular angle when he was about to apply pressure to someone he had already decided about. There was a candidate in the course named Phelan. James Phelan, 24 years old, from a small town in Montana called Lima, which was the kind of name that made you wonder what the town had been hoping for when it picked it. Phelan was technically brilliant. His flat-range scores in weeks 1 and 2 were some of the highest in the class. But the moment an evaluator walked up behind him, something in his mechanics shifted in exactly the direction that mechanics can't afford to shift. His groups opened. His transitions slowed. He became, under observation, a slightly worse version of himself. Winslow recognized this because she had been this at 22. Her first advanced course, she had shot terrified for 3 weeks before a warrant officer named Greer. Not a warm man, but the right man for that specific piece of information at that specific time, told her she was fighting her own body, and her body was going to keep winning until she stopped. She found Phelan on the range after the formal training day had ended, running dry-fire drills in the last light. "You're slowing your exhales," she said. "Right before the break. You're giving yourself an extra beat, and it's costing you." He looked up. He had not heard her approach. "You do it when you know someone's watching," she said. "You're not breathing wrong. You're managing your breathing instead of letting it run. There's a difference." He fell and looked at her for a moment. "How do you know when someone's watching?" he asked. "Because you shoot differently. I watched your stages for 3 days before I said anything. You shoot alone the way most people wish they shot. You shoot observed like you're apologizing for something." He was quiet. "It won't fix itself," she said, "but it fixes." The next morning, his groups tightened by 35%. His chief instructor, Warrant Officer Tillman, gray-haired, economical with praise, the kind of man who kept score internally and only declared the final tally, marked something in his log and did not say what, but his expression said approximately enough. Word traveled the way it always travels in close environments. By the end of week 2, something had shifted in the quality of attention the other candidates paid to Winslow, from assessment to something more like interest. Colfax noticed. He said nothing about it. The problem with her equipment started on a Thursday afternoon during an extended range session. Winslow was running a 900-meter engagement sequence, 6 steel targets, 1 round each, working right to left at a pace that required managing both position transitions and environmental reads simultaneously. Her first shot landed 4 inches high and 3 left at 900 meters. She adjusted. The adjustment didn't hold the way an adjustment should. It tracked in one direction and drifted in another, and not consistently, it varied, which was the detail that told her everything she needed to know about what was happening. A scope develops consistent errors. A zero drift from impact goes one direction. Random drift within a range is something someone does to a scope, not something a scope does to itself. She completed the sequence without showing anything on her face. She confirmed 4 of 6 targets. She wrote the number in her own log before the official tally was posted. That evening, she stripped the scope assembly completely and found what someone had done to the tension on the elevation adjustment. Not dramatic, not something a quick inspection would catch, something that required knowing exactly what you were looking for and the patience to look for it. She corrected it, re-zeroed in the last light, and told no one. Not because she didn't know who had done it. She had a strong enough suspicion to call it a conviction. But a conviction without documentation in an environment already looking for reasons to question. Her judgment was not ammunition, it was exposure. Her father had told her once, sitting on a ridge in Tennessee watching a hollow fill with mist. Some fights you win by engaging and some you win by waiting until the other person has already lost. The difference is knowing which fight you're in. She waited. The score adjustment came in week 3. She finished a stalking exercise in a time that she knew, from her own calculations, represented the highest composite score in the group. Environmental red, concealment quality, transition discipline, engagement accuracy. When the posted scores appeared, she was ranked 6th. Staff Sergeant Leon Riker, who had come through the stalk after her, was ranked 2nd. Riker was 29 years old, built the way the Army designed training to build people, and had been the most uniformly skeptical presence in the course since day one. Not hostile, skeptical. The specific skepticism of someone who had earned their position through routes that didn't require acknowledging anyone else's, and who genuinely could not understand why the route should look different for someone else. He came and stood beside her at the scoreboard. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not what she expected from him. "I watched your approach," he said. "I was 2 positions behind you. Your stalk was cleaner than mine. Your position establishment was cleaner. I saw both." "I know," she said. "So why are you ranked 6th? She looked at the board for another moment. "Keep shooting," she said. She filed a formal inquiry with the course administrative element that afternoon. Not because she expected the score to change that day, because documentation was its own form of record, and records had a way of mattering in directions you couldn't always anticipate when you were making them. 2 days later, Colfax called a full class formation at 5:30. Not a training event, a formation. Candidates standing in the dark, breath visible, no one knowing the reason. Colfax walked out and stood in front of them. "There is a candidate in this course," he said, "who has filed a formal inquiry against the course's evaluation process. He did not use her name. He didn't need to. Every eye that wasn't locked forward slid sideways for exactly 1 second. In 11 years running this program and 15 years before, that in which I attended programs like it, I have never seen a candidate question the integrity of how this course is evaluated." His voice was level, which was worse than if it hadn't been, because candidates who reach this program understand something. This course does not owe you a specific score. It owes you the truth about your performance. And the truth is sometimes harder to hear than the number you wanted. He stopped in front of Winslow. He held the pause. "Are we clear, Sergeant?" "Yes, Sergeant Major," she said, no color in her voice, none at all. He walked away. What he didn't see, because he had already turned, was Riker. Riker, standing 4 positions to her left, looked at the back of Colfax's retreating figure, and then at Winslow, and the expression on his face had traveled a very long distance in 3 weeks. It was not sympathy. Riker was not constructed for sympathy. It was something closer to recognition. The specific look of a man who had just watched something unjust happen and had the uncomfortable experience of knowing it. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but she filed that moment away with everything else. The dual stress protocol ran in week 4. Physical degradation, followed immediately by a precision engagement exercise, followed immediately by a panel interview, assessing decision-making under compound fatigue, legitimate training with legitimate purpose. Shooting instructors operated in exactly these conditions, and the course had a real interest in knowing who fell apart under them and who didn't. Winslow's version of the protocol had a modification. During the physical phase, she was routed through an additional obstacle crossing that added 6 minutes to her time and cost her the position sequence that mattered for the transition to the engagement line. She didn't realize it until she was already through it. She had memorized the standard route during the morning walkthrough, every candidate's route marker and where it diverged. She had done this as a habit, the way her father had taught her to always know 2 ways into a place before you needed to know 2 ways out. She arrived at the engagement line late. She engaged 5 of 6 targets in the remaining window, 5 of 6 under deliberately compromised conditions, a passing score, not her score. In the panel interview afterward, an instructor named Brandt asked whether her result reflected her actual capability. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because my route through the physical phase differed from the standard route in a way that affected my transition time. I can walk you through the specific divergence. I memorized both routes this morning." A pause. "Both," Brandt said. "I noticed my route marker was set differently during the walkthrough. I committed both to memory, so I'd have a reference point if the difference became relevant." Brandt closed his folder. "I see," he said. That evening, Riker came to the common room where 8 other candidates were present and held up his phone. On the screen was a photograph, route markers, clearly, from the morning walkthrough. 2 paths, one standard, one that led through an additional crossing that no other candidate had run. "I thought it was a logistics error," he said. His voice was not quiet. He had chosen deliberately not to make it quiet. "I took this to ask Winslow about it because I figured she'd already noticed. Then the protocol ran." He paused, "and I figured things out." The room was still. "I'm going to Tillman," Riker said. He looked at Winslow for one moment. "You can come or not. That's your call. But I'm going." He walked out. A candidate named Soto, quiet, from New Mexico, who had said perhaps 12 words to Winslow since the course began, stood up from his chair, picked up his coffee, and said to no one in particular, "Me too," and followed Riker out the door. What happened in Tillman's office was not theatrical. Tillman looked at the photograph for a long time. He asked a few questions. He thanked them. His expression when they left was the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not finding the sum acceptable. Colfax called Winslow to his office that evening. She had prepared herself for anger. What she found was something she hadn't prepared for. A man who looked tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. He told her the route variance had been classified as a procedural error. Her score would be recalculated on the standard transition window. Her result, 6 of 6. "Is there anything you want to say?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "No, Sergeant Major," she said. He nodded. He dismissed her. In the hallway outside his office, she put her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 10 seconds. She let herself feel what she had not permitted herself to feel in front of him. The exhaustion, the anger, the specific grinding weight of being excellent and spending more energy defending the right to be recognized as adequate than she had spent being excellent. 10 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and walked back to work. There were still 3 weeks of course remaining. And somewhere in the West Virginia mountains, there was a steel plate at wet 300 meters between 2 ridgelines that had been refusing to give anyone a confirmed hit for 18 years. She was almost there. The final block ran in the mountains of West Virginia, at a range facility built into the Appalachians that the Army used because the terrain did things to ballistics that flat ranges couldn't replicate. 22 candidates had started. 16 had made it to this range. Winslow knew what Iron Ridge 6 was before Colfax briefed it. She had read every piece of documentation the course made available. 18 years of history, 641 candidates. 0 confirmed hits on the plate at 300 meters, positioned in the hollow between 2 ridgelines, where the terrain did something to the air that the documentation described as unpredictable environmental variance that exceeds reliable calculation methodology. Unpredictable, that was the word they used. The evening before the final qualification day, after the day's formal training ended, she went alone to the ridge above Iron Ridge 6, not to the firing position, to the high ground between the ridge lines, where she could look down into the hollow from above rather than across. She watched for 90 minutes. What the documentation called unpredictable was not unpredictable. It was complex. The distinction mattered because complex had structure, and structure had pattern, and pattern had solution. The hollow was doing something with the air driven by the temperature differential. Between the ridge tops and the valley floor, in the late afternoon, warm air from the valley rising against cool air coming over the ridges from the north, creating a rotational pocket in the lower hollow that cycled through compression and expansion. On a schedule, the temperature differential set. She watched it in the movement of dry grass on the hollow floor, in the behavior of a red-tailed hawk hunting the hollow and adjusting its dive angle with a consistency that was not random. She started counting when she had seen enough of the cycle to count it. 7 seconds. She counted it 8 more times. 6.5, 7, 7, 6.5, 7. The variance was within the range of atmospheric temperature fluctuation, which was itself predictable based on time of day and cloud cover, which she had been watching too. This was not chaos. This was a pattern that had been there for 18 years, waiting for someone patient enough to sit still on a ridgeline for 90 minutes and watch until they found it. Her father had told her once, on a Tennessee hillside when she was 8 years old, that the woods were always talking. Most people were too busy making noise to hear it. If you wanted to know what the woods were actually doing, You found something that lived there and depended on knowing, and you watched what it watched. The hawk had been telling every candidate who ever shot at Iron Ridge 6 the same answer. No one had been watching long enough to hear it. She sat on the ridgeline and did the math for the next hour. Bullet velocity, time of flight, the specific window in the 7-second cycle when the rotational pocket in the hollow reached maximum displacement from the target's flight path, and the net influence on her round dropped below the margin she could account for with technique. When she walked back to the facility, it was full dark, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. An instructor named Brant was sitting outside. He watched her come in from the direction of the ridge and said nothing. She didn't need him to say anything. She already had what she'd gone to find. The final morning arrived cold and clear. Colfax briefed the evolution at 0800 at the primary firing line, his back to the hollow below. He laid out the history of Iron Ridge 6 the way a man lays out a case he considers already settled. 18 years, 641 candidates, 0 confirmed hits. The environmental conditions in the hollow created variance beyond reliable calculation. The shot was not a failure of candidate ability. It was a physical reality. He paused. He looked directly at Winslow. "Physics says so," he said. Same words as the previous day's briefing, harder this time, delivered as a wall she was supposed to run into. The first candidate shot at 0815, technically excellent. He read the flags at the firing line and the flag at the hollow's entrance and calculated accordingly. The round hit the ridgeline below and left of the plate. The hollow had taken it. The second candidate missed high, the third missed right. By the 7th miss, the energy on the line had settled into something dense and shared, not failure, but the accumulation of understanding that the conditions were not cooperating with any methodology any of them had brought to this range. Riker shot 12th. He set up with deliberateness. He spent 45 seconds reading the available environmental indicators. He made his correction. He fired. The round passed inside 6 feet of the plate before the hollow deflected it. Riker stood, looked through his spotter scope at the impact point, and said one word quietly that nobody repeated later. Then he turned to Winslow. "The air in the lower hollow is doing something the flags aren't giving you," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, the specific quality of a man who had been approaching a conclusion for several weeks and had finally arrived. "You figured it out," he said, not a question. "I think so. Last night, on the ridge." "Yes." He held her gaze for one more second. "Then go hit it," he said. Flat and direct, the way he said everything he actually meant. Candidates 13 through 15 shot in sequence. Soto came close. His round passed within 3 feet of the plate before the hollow claimed it, almost. Then there was one candidate left. Colfax stepped forward. His voice carried across the entire line. "No one makes this shot," he said. "Not in 18 years, not today." He looked directly at Winslow. "Physics says so." She stepped to the firing line. She did not look at Colfax. She did not look at the other candidates, or the instructors, or the wind flags that had already failed 16 men this morning. She lowered herself into position behind the rifle, and her cheek found the stock, and her eye found the scope. Then she did something every instructor on the line noticed simultaneously, without being able to immediately name why it mattered. She did not begin her standard environmental read. She looked into the hollow, with her scope, not interpolating from the flags. Looking at something in the hollow itself. Tillman moved to the spotting scope. He traversed it slowly across the hollow floor, looking for what she was looking for. After perhaps 20 seconds, he found something in the movement of the dry grass near the hollow's floor, something rotational, something that moved in a pattern that was not random. He was very still behind the scope. Brant said quietly, "What is she doing?" "Waiting," Tillman said. "For what?" Tillman didn't answer. Riker stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching Winslow with the attention of a man who understood something important was happening and had chosen to be fully present for it. Beside him, Phelan had his hands flat at his sides, very still, in the way young soldiers are still when they are managing something they've never managed before. 2 minutes passed, then 2.5. Some candidates shifted. No one spoke. Winslow was counting. She had started her count from the last rotation she'd seen in the hollow grass before settling into position. She was at 4 seconds. The cycle was 7. At 6 seconds, the rotational pocket reached maximum displacement from the center line of her shot. The moment when its influence on her round's path dropped below the threshold she had calculated the previous night on the ridgeline. The window was 2 seconds. Her father's voice in her memory: "You don't fight conditions you can't control. You learn their schedule and you show up ready." She was ready. 6 seconds. She took a slow breath, let it complete, found the natural pause at the bottom, the still quarter second between exhale and the body's first pull toward the next inhale. The quiet moment, her father had called it. The only moment the body is fully at rest. 7 seconds. The grass in the hollow shifted. The hawk above the target adjusted its wing angle. There it was, right there. The window she had spent 90 minutes the previous evening on a cold ridgeline figuring out how to find. She didn't think. Thinking was for the preparation. This was for the trust. She fired. The rifle moved. The sound broke across the hollow and returned from both ridgelines simultaneously, a doubled percussion rolling away through the mountains. Tillman was at the spotting scope. He had the plate centered. He was watching. At 1.7 seconds, clank. The sound came back clean and metal and unmistakable. The sound a steel plate makes when a round hits it dead center. A sound Tillman had been listening for. On this range for 8 years and had never heard until this moment. He pulled his eye from the scope. He looked at Brant. Brant had his hand over his mouth. "Confirmed hit," Tillman said. His voice was completely flat in the way that means a man is holding everything he actually feels below the level of his voice because letting it up right now is not appropriate. Iron Ridge 6. Round 1, center mass. For 1 full second, nothing happened. Then Phelan made a sound that wasn't a word. It came from somewhere below language, from the place where things that are too large for words go first. He was looking at the hollow, and then at Winslow, and then at the hollow again. Soto sat down on the ground exactly where he was standing, without apparent decision, as if his legs had simply chosen for him. Riker turned away from the line. He stood with his back to everything for a moment, and no one looked at him during that moment, which was the right call. Then Phelan started clapping, slow, deliberate, not a celebration, something larger than celebration, the way you acknowledge something you know you'll carry for the rest of your life. Tillman set down his clipboard and joined it, then Brant, then Soto from the ground, then the candidates, all 15 of the others, in a swell that built without anyone organizing it, because it didn't need to be organized. Riker turned back around. He was last. His clap was single and hard and two-handed, and his face was the face of a man who had been somewhere and come back from it and knew the difference. Winslow was still behind the rifle. Then slowly she stood. She looked at Colfax. Colfax had not moved from where he'd been standing when he said, "Not today, not ever." He was looking at Winslow with an expression that was doing something complicated, working through several layers before it reached the surface. It was not anger. It was past anger. It was what anger becomes when it runs out of the thing that was fueling it and finds something older and rawer underneath. She walked off the firing line to a place 20 feet from the group. She reached into the breast pocket of her blouse. The photograph was worn at the corners. A man and a girl of maybe 7 on a Tennessee hillside. The man had a spotting scope. The girl was behind a .22 rifle that was almost as tall as she was, and she was grinning the way children grin when they have just understood something for the first time. On the back of the photograph, in her own handwriting, was a list she did not need to read. She just looked at the man in the photograph. The man who had put the spotting scope in her hands and told her to watch the hawk, not the wind flags, because the hawk depended on the answer and couldn't afford to get it wrong. After a while, she became aware that someone was standing nearby and had been standing there long enough that she had been seen with the photograph and there had been no interruption of that. Colfax, 10 feet away, waiting in the particular way of a man who has something he needs to say and has never needed to say it before, and is therefore not certain how it goes. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She looked at him. The current that had been running between them for 6 weeks, challenge, pressure, assessment, was gone. Just a hollow behind them and the mountains and the morning. Colfax looked at the ground, then at the ridgeline where she had sat the previous night, Then at her. How long were you up there, he said. 90 minutes. He was quiet. You found the cycle. Yes. No one has done that, he said. 18 years. No candidate has gone to that ridge and watched long enough to find it. A pause. I checked the original installation documentation this morning. The construction team noted the air behavior in the hollow during the site survey. They called it too irregular to be usable. He paused again. They were wrong. They weren't watching the right things, she said. Something in that landed on him in a specific place. No, he said after a moment, they weren't. The wind moved through the hollow. A long, low sound, air through rock. Then Colfax said, my brother's name was Tommy. She went still. She had not expected that. He was 10 years younger than me. He wanted to go through the selection pipeline I'd spent my first career around. I told him he wasn't ready. He went anyway. The pause that followed had weight accumulated across years. He made it 9 weeks. The pressure wasn't the physical pressure. He was built for that. It was everything else. The specific kind of pressure that comes from every person in the room, having already decided what you are before you open your mouth. He stopped. He never came back from it, not the way he was before. She held very still. I spent 15 years after that, Colfax said, believing the door was the problem. That the most decent thing I could do was make sure nobody else's Tommy walked through a door that was going to take something from them they couldn't get back. He looked at her directly. I applied that to every person I thought the door would break. I applied it wrong. The silence between them was dense. Tommy deserved better than what happened to him, she said quietly. Something moved across Colfax's face, deep and fast and private. Yes, he said after a moment, so did you. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed an envelope. He held it in both hands in a way that communicated he understood what he was holding. Battlefield promotion recommendation, he said. My signature, submitted this morning through proper channels. It also carries a formal commendation for the highest individual score in the history of this course. He extended it. She took it. Not because I was pressured, he said, low enough that it was essentially a private conversation. Not as a remedy, as recognition for 6 weeks of performance that was better than what I have trained in 11 years, and for a shot that 18 years of this program told every candidate the conditions would not allow. She looked at the envelope, then at him. What changed? She asked. He was quiet for a long time. I told Tommy I wasn't sure he was ready, he said. That was the last real conversation we had. I never forgave myself for it, and somewhere between that and today, I started making everyone else carry what I was carrying. That's not what protection looks like. He held her gaze. I know the difference now. I'm sorry it took this long to know it. Tommy didn't fail, she said. The people in the room failed him. Colfax's jaw tightened once. Yes, he said, they did. He straightened. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip held 1 beat longer than a formal handshake. In that 1 beat was everything that didn't have words. Then he nodded, turned, and walked back toward the facility. Tillman was waiting by the operations building. He had watched the entire exchange from 40 feet away and made no effort to pretend otherwise. When Colfax reached him, Tillman looked at his commanding officer's face and read it the way he read everything, with attention, with experience, with the willingness to see what was actually there rather than what he'd expected. What he saw made him exhale slowly through his nose. Don't, Colfax said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were. Tillman considered this. I was going to say it considerably more diplomatically than you're imagining. And Colfax, for the first time in 6 weeks, possibly longer, made a sound that was almost a laugh. It lasted half a second, then it was gone, but it had been there. That evening, after the administrative processing and the conversations that happen when long, difficult things end and people are working out how to say goodbye, Winslow sat alone on a bench outside the barracks with her rifle case at her feet. Phelan came and sat beside her without asking, which was the right call. He looked at the photograph she was holding. Your dad, he said. Yeah, he would have loved today. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The man with the spotting scope. The girl grinning behind a rifle almost as big as she was. The Tennessee hills rolling away behind them both. He did love today, she said. He just loved it a long time before it happened. Phelan didn't say anything to that. He just sat with her in the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and know that the silence is itself the conversation. After a while, Riker came out and stood in the doorway. He looked at the two of them on the bench. He looked at whatever calculation he was running. Then he walked over and sat down on the far end, 3 feet of space between them, and nobody acknowledged it and everybody understood it. After a few minutes, he said, without preamble, "I said something on day 1 in the processing bay, when Colfax dropped the file. The air between them was still. I didn't say it loud, but you heard it." She looked at him. "Yes. I was wrong," he said. Flat clean, no softening. Just the thing itself, the way a serious person says a serious error without architecture around it to make the saying easier on himself. She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. He looked slightly surprised, as if he had prepared for a longer conversation. "What else would there be?" she said. "You were wrong. You figured it out. You did something about it. That's how it's supposed to work." He looked away. His jaw was at the angle that meant he was giving something the respect it deserved. Soto came out of the barracks and sat on the ground nearby without ceremony. Then 2 other candidates, then a third. Nobody orchestrated it. People kept arriving until there were 8 of them in the cooling evening outside the barracks, and the conversation moved away. Good conversations move, slowly at first, and then with increasing ease from the day to the course to the things people say when they've stopped performing and started actually talking. Later, alone in the barracks, Winslow took out the index card from her breast pocket. 3 lines, her father's handwriting on the left side, hers on the right, written the night he died. She had read them in forward operating bases and field hospitals and cargo planes in the dark. She had read them when she was more tired than she thought a person could be, and when the world seemed arranged specifically to make her disappear. She took a pen from her jacket. She looked at the 3rd line. Then she put a check mark beside it. She sat with that for a long time, the completed list, the photograph on the bench beside her, the sounds somewhere in the West Virginia, dark of wind, moving through the hollow. The same wind that had been cycling through those ridgelines for 1,000 years, patient and indifferent, and there for anyone willing to sit still long enough to read it. She thought about her father. She thought about Tommy Colfax, who had stood at a door and asked the wrong person whether he belonged there, and who had received an answer shaped more by fear than by truth. She thought about every person who had stood at a door and been told, by the shape of the room itself, that the door wasn't theirs. And she thought about what her father had said once, on a Tennessee hillside, when she was 12 and frustrated and convinced that a particular shot was beyond her. He had put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Great shooters hit targets. That's not the whole thing." She had looked at him. "What's the whole thing?" He had looked at the mountains. "Great warriors," he said, "change what people believe is possible." She'd been 12 and hadn't understood it all the way through. She understood it now. In the years that followed, every woman who entered the Joint Advanced Marksmanship Instructor course heard the story before she fired her first round at the qualification range. Phelan told it. He had a gift for it, the particular gift of someone who'd been in the room and knew what he'd witnessed. Soto told it quietly to people who needed it privately, in the moments before something difficult. Riker told it with the plainness of a man who had been on the wrong side of it, and said so without decoration, which turned out to be the version that landed hardest of all. The story always ended the same way. A hollow in the West Virginia mountains. A steel plate that 641 candidates across 18 years had been told the conditions would not allow. A woman who spent 90 minutes on a ridgeline watching a hawk until she understood the schedule the air kept, and then showed up to the firing line, ready for the one window she had found. 7 seconds, 1 round, dead center. The story ended there, but the thing the story left behind was larger than the story and longer, and it didn't end when the telling did. Because the shot Winslow fired on that cold West Virginia morning didn't just travel 300 meters through a hollow that everyone had agreed was unreadable. It traveled forward, through every qualification class that came after, through every woman who stood at a firing line and heard the story and understood what it meant. Not that the conditions were fair, Not that the room had been ready to believe before the proof arrived, but that ready didn't matter. The hollow still stands in the Appalachians. The plate still hangs at 300 meters. Between two ridgelines the mountains built, without any interest in what people would eventually try to prove there. The air still cycles through that hollow on its 7-second schedule, patient and consistent and entirely indifferent to whether anyone is watching. But someone is always watching now, because one person showed the rest of them how. That was the thing her father had been pointing at all along, standing on a Tennessee hillside with a spotting scope in his hands and a daughter who didn't yet know what she was becoming beside him. He had known. He had been patient enough to wait for her to find out. The hawk had known too.